will be joining me live for an update at midnight Eastern Time. We'll be checking in with him then. Standing by, though, first is Mikhail Troitskiy. He's with Tufts University. He joins me. This is going to be one of many interviews we do tonight, analyzing what we can. And let's just talk about right off the top, Mikhail. How much can we even analyze at this point? How much did we really learn? How much did we really take from today's summit in Alaska?
Well, I think although the summit might look inconclusive at this point, we did learn a lot from what we just saw. I think first and foremost is that some progress is being achieved. And so the Russian side has been able to tread the narrow path between really upsetting President Trump with the lack of willingness to make a deal on one hand, and on the other hand, proposing something short of an immediate agreement to a ceasefire. That, I think, is what Donald Trump wanted from Vladimir Putin. He wanted a declaration. So they stopped short of offering that declaration, but at the same time, they kind of moved the ball into someone else's court, and that should probably be Ukraine or the European Union or both. So Donald Trump is not losing hope, and rightly so, I believe. But the Kremlin was not ready to deal at this stage. They might be dragging out. They might still be tapping the United States along in this situation, but they might well be willing to deal. And I think we just heard that Donald Trump is willing to give Russia another 2 weeks before he might consider enacting more stringent sanctions against Russia.
As we've been watching all this play out in the past few hours, much of Europe has either been in the late night hours or early morning hours. Presumably, we'll be looking out for any reaction on social media from any of the key states involved as the sun comes up over there. You mentioned about the ball being in Ukraine's court, Europe's court. What are the first steps that those entities can make from here? Let's take this from Zelensky's point of view, or if you want, from the EU's point of view.
Well, that depends on what Vladimir Putin meant by root causes of the war in Ukraine at this stage. Of course, many people would rightly say that he himself is the root cause of the war. But the root cause rhetoric when it is performed by the Russians usually means ban on Ukraine's membership in NATO, maybe also in the European Union, some kind of special rights for the Russian language and culture in Ukraine, and you name it. We can go on and on and on. So that is something that would be very difficult to implement, to just pull off a ceasefire. So you cannot condition a ceasefire with these demands. So if this was what Putin meant by addressing the root causes, then I don't think there's much Europe and certainly Ukraine can do. But if there's something relatively negotiable, such as some kind of a declaration on the lack of immediate willingness of NATO to accept Ukraine, for example, or they are still talking about some land swaps that should occur, that might occur simultaneously with the ceasefire, that may be something that Donald Trump thinks of as reasonable terms, or at least negotiable terms, although I think he acknowledges they are going to be tough primarily for Ukraine, for Ukraine's President Zelenskyy to consider. So I guess the next step would probably be for everyone to learn from some leaks coming out of Ukraine and the European Union, what those conditions, what those last hurdles that need to be cleared are, and whether Ukraine and also Europe considers removing those hurdles a reasonable deal.
You mentioned the word culture. Can you help our largely American audience understand, maybe compare and contrast the cultures between Russia and Ukraine, there's more similarities than some people might understand.
Um, well, indeed, Russia and Ukraine coexisted as a single state for several centuries. Although Ukrainians have, of course, been living in other countries across Eastern Europe. Of course, Ukraine is a distinct nation with its distinct language, which is quite difficult to understand for a Russian speaker without proper training. And Ukraine has got its own great literature and music composers and you name it. So there is indeed a distinction, although before the annexation of Crimea, I would say that happened in 2014. There was little animosity in Ukraine towards Russian culture per se. There are, of course, plenty of mixed families, and there are plenty of people. And Ukraine at that time was Russian speaking in large part. Almost everyone could and would speak Russian if you addressed them in Russian. But of course, that said, Ukraine has always been building its nation state, at least since 1991, when it became independent from the USSR. So since that time, of course, Ukrainian authorities were keen to assert Ukrainian language as the official or state language in Ukraine. And of course, they were touting Ukrainian culture. And they were, of course, trying to distinguish Ukraine and build their national identity on the distinction between Ukraine and Russia. And this is quite understandable. All former Soviet republics were doing just the same thing. So why, the Kremlin got so obsessed with nation building in Ukraine, with peaceful nation building, is a difficult thing to understand. So to sum up, these are very close cultures. Languages are quite close, but they're certainly not the same. The willingness of Ukraine to build its own state in the aftermath of the breakup of the USSR is understandable. There was nothing that we should there was nothing that should have triggered this overreaction by Russia, by Putin and the Kremlin in the form of annexing Crimea and then, of course, going to full-scale war with Ukraine.
So one thing that Zelenskyy has said he wants from any sort of deal is he wants robust security guarantees against future Russian aggression. Can you put that in plain English for us? What type of plan would he be talking about there?
Well, I think ideally the Ukrainian leadership wants membership in NATO and or the European Union as soon as possible. A commitment to accept Ukraine in the foreseeable future into NATO. The EU is a longer-term perspective, of course, so such commitment to accept Ukraine into NATO could probably also work. But that said, I think Kiev would prefer some form of immediate guarantee, likely deployment of European troops on the ground in Ukraine, maybe not near the front lines, the line of control as it might emerge after a ceasefire, but certainly somewhere in Ukraine to sort of be tripwire troops to trigger some kind of reaction on the part of European states involved in protecting Ukraine should Russia choose to go ahead with another assault or invasion. So this, I think, is what Ukraine is trying to achieve. And I think it's up to major European Union states to decide whether they truly want to put their boots on the ground. And they have vacillated as of late on whether they are amenable to sending their contingents in Ukraine. But definitely Ukraine wants some ironclad guarantees in the form of some tripwire plus a clear prospect of membership in NATO and the European Union.
Let's talk about what Putin wants. I wrote some notes here because there's a list, so I'm going to read the list that I have. This is what Putin wants. He wants Kyiv to cede the regions that Moscow annexed in 2022, even though Russia doesn't fully control them. He wants to recognize Crimea, which was illegally annexed in 2014 as part of Russia. He wants Ukraine to renounce its effort to join NATO and limit its armed forces. And then finally, he wants recognition of Russia as an official of Russian as an official language, along with Ukrainian. Are all of those non-starters from Ukraine's perspective? Let's give the audience some context as to why we're at such a standstill.
Well, some of that might certainly be non-starters, but it depends how you frame it. So, for example, a land swap, swapping some of the lands that Russia has been occupying since the start of the invasion, somewhere in the south of Ukraine, for pieces of Donbass, of eastern Ukraine, could probably work as a deal, as an acceptable deal for Ukraine. But certainly handing strategically important chunks of land to Russia without Russia actually conquering them just to achieve a ceasefire would be a non-starter from Ukraine. And again, we can only guess whether that was something that Putin asked President Trump to convey to the Europeans and the Ukrainians as a precondition for peace. Donald Trump did seem, if not puzzled, but a little bit skeptical about whether Ukrainians can accept whatever Russians were offering. And Donald Trump never disclosed what that actually was. But if it's just transferring land from Ukraine to Russia for the sake of a ceasefire, that is likely to be a non-starter. But doing that with the prospect of some further exchange of chunks of occupied territory might be more acceptable. Then when it comes to NATO membership, I guess it's just simply very difficult for anyone to issue guarantees of Ukraine's non-membership in NATO. The only guarantee that one can think about could be Ukraine's own declaration or an amendment to the country's constitution that would prohibit membership in NATO. But that, I think, is not going to work in the current political climate in Ukraine, quite understandably so. And the same, I think, applies to the official status of the Russian language, which is indeed considered in Ukraine the language of the enemy. But some land swaps and maybe some kind of understanding reached between or among Ukraine, Russia, and NATO to the effect that Ukraine might not be joining NATO anytime soon could be part of that deal. Again, if it is acceptable to Ukraine, and I guess you could read in what President Trump was saying post summit today that it might be a difficult, those might be difficult conditions for Ukraine to accept at the moment, but they are not hopeless.
So, Mikhail, before we go, what questions do you have moving forward, whether it be later tonight, whether it be into the weekend or into next week? What are you looking for next?
I'm looking to really learn what's going on in that negotiation. So clearly, and that is the position of President Trump, you shouldn't divulge specific details about what is being discussed. And that is completely understandable. Much of that haggling should go behind the scenes or behind closed doors. However, it is important that this secrecy doesn't undermine the clarity of the position of of the sides involved, and it doesn't thwart the deal just because questions remain unanswered. So, giving some publicity to what is actually being discussed, to some of the terms, may provide that clarity and may force the sides to actually publicly define their position, and and defining their position comes with a cost that that they would eventually have to pay if they don't make a deal. So my question would be whether we could really get a sneak peek into the terms that are now being set forth by Russia as a precondition for the ceasefire that President Trump is seeking and that Ukraine has unconditionally agreed to.
Mikhail Troitskiy is with Tufts University. Thanks for staying up late with us tonight. Have a good weekend.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, so let's hit a quick commercial break. 10:30 in the nation's capital, just about. Hal Kempfer joining me in studio.